Thursday, May 7th, 1925. Moscow, 11 p.m. It was a beautiful spring evening in the city. A man nervously shuffles around an office on the 5th floor of a building called Lubyanka. He shares this room with 3 others. They have a simple task of keeping an eye on the man while they wait for guards to take him back to his cell. The man was visibly unwell. He had been pacing back and forth and was making seemingly random small talk with his captors. At this exact moment, it is impossible to know exactly what he was thinking. Maybe he was reminiscing about his past, or maybe he was planning for his future. A future that would come very, very quickly. One of the guards checks his watch. 11:19. Fate had come calling. Now, we're gonna freeze at 11:19 p.m. The man most certainly had a life worth reminiscing. Had it flashed before his eyes right then and there, it would have taken hours to get through it all. So, let's go on a journey through it. Half a century of context is required to understand his next decision, and I love telling stories. His is a tale of love and loss, corruption and heroism, betrayal and subterfuge, and whatever other action drama buzzwords you would like to add. But above all, his is a tale of terror and strangely colored horses. This is the tale of Boris Viktorovich Savinkov. Our topic of today was born on January 19th, Old Style Calendar, 1879 in Kharkiv in northeastern Ukraine. He was the 3rd child of 6 to the marriage of Victor and Sophia, both Russians. Victor was a judge, so the family was quite well off, and both of his parents held progressive views for the time. This will rub off on little Boris very quickly, which is why I brought it up. He had 2 brothers, Alexander and Victor, and 3 sisters, Nadezhda, Sophia, and Vera. You like name dumps? You're gonna get a shitload of name dumps in this story. Him being born in Kharkiv was an outlier, as the family made its actual home in Warsaw, in occupied Poland. The family as a whole was actually rather well liked by the local population. His mother Sophia was a very smart girl, and she took education very seriously. It was through her that Boris would learn French, German, and Polish, along with his native Russian. He would attend Warsaw's first gymnasium for his youth. He got good grades and was by all accounts a pretty normal teenager. The main important thing that occurred here was him meeting the first of our major recurring characters in this story, Ivan Kalyaev. The two hit it off and would be friends for life. Boris graduated in 1897, having developed into a very educated and well-rounded fellow with a particular love for reading and writing. He also developed an attachment to Polish culture, very much disavowing the chauvinism common at the time. This combined with his liberal views inherited from his family to make Savinkov the exact opposite of a Russian aristocrat. In 1897, he began attending St. Petersburg University to study law. His first experience with the freedom that was provided had interesting consequences, because when he was at home for Christmas, he was fucking arrested in a night raid along with his brother Alexander. You see, the two had gotten themselves involved in various student movements in St. Petersburg, and the imperial government didn't like that very much. His father was able to pull some strings and get them released a few days later. However, this little shit show would set a precedent. 2 months later, Alexander got arrested again for protesting, and this time he spent 7 months in solitary confinement, permanently wrecking his health. Boris continued the protest work in his absence. Joined by Kalyaev, the two progressively radicalized themselves as the student bodies around the country got more and more pissed off at the policies of the imperial government. This came to a head in late 1899, when, after a particularly violent protest that saw half the entire fucking university get arrested, Savinkov was expelled and banned from attending every university in Russia. On the bright side, that same year, he would get married to an equally hot-headed girl named Vera Uspenskaya. Do not get her confused with his sister. He went off to finish his education in Europe, first at U of Berlin, then U of Heidelberg, before ending up in Paris. During this time, Vera would give birth to Savinkov's first child, Tatiana. While he was abroad, he also encountered the Russian émigré community, a community which, at this point in time, happened to align with his beliefs about the Tsar very nicely. He did a little schmoozing, made some connections, and took some mental notes. He never technically finished his education, but at this point, it wasn't really about that anymore. Savinkov returned to Russia in 1901 with new ideas, settling in St. Petersburg with his wife and daughter. Cops have long memories though, and in April of that year he would be arrested for spreading anti-government propaganda. This is where our first organization shows up. I said there would be a lot of names, so you better be taking notes. This little group would become Savinkov's arch-nemesis for the next decade and a half. It was called the Okhrana, formerly known as the Department for Protection of Public Safety and Order. It was formed in the 1860s and served as the secret police in Imperial Russia. They were primarily directed towards dealing with any and all activity deemed revolutionary, and they developed some unorthodox methods for dealing with this activity. Notably, they took a divide-and-conquer approach, sowed disunity among the groups by playing them off each other using networks of double agents. This worked like a charm for the most part, and for a while they succeeded in keeping the lid on things. They would be the reason for Savinkov repeatedly getting screwed over. He spent 10 months in jail, much to the lamentation of his very distraught wife. His second child, named Victor, not to be confused with his father or his brother, would be born that October while he was still in prison. After this stint, it was decided that Savinkov was too dangerous to be kept in the capital, so they exiled him to the one place every Russian fears: Vologda. Wait, what? Yeah, as it turns out, only the actual super dangerous people got sent to Siberia. Savinkov basically just got put in the timeout corner rather than being punished. I'm not even joking when I say that. He straight up got to visit his parents in Warsaw, pick where he wanted to live, get a job, and bring his family along with him. He basically just moved on the government paycheck. During his time, he mostly just chilled out and did a shitload of writing, both political stuff, but also some fiction here and there. He even got one of his short stories published, which was pretty cool. Most importantly, however, were the people who were also in Vologda. Basically, all the revolutionaries who weren't these super big names spent time in the city, so Savinkov got to know the revolutionary cause very well. It was here where he was formally introduced to the titans of Russian leftism. The big cheese on the left was the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDRP for people who don't hate themselves. This party had split in two over ideological disputes. The moderates became known as the Bolsheviks, who were generally more social democrat leaning. Meanwhile, the radicals under Vladimir Lenin became the Bolsheviks. Now, as you may know, the Bolsheviks were a rather detestable folk, so we ain't gonna pay them much mind until later in the story, but just keep in mind that they exist for now. Anyways, this party was not the only force of socialism in Russia. Somewhere between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks on the spectrum sat the Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, henceforth referred to as the SRs. The SRs popped into existence at the turn of the 20th century and rapidly grew in numbers. They appealed primarily to the peasantry and the students, and later were able to siphon a lot of working class support off the various liberal and social democrat factions through their populist stances. They were pretty standard capital S socialists, land reform, labor laws, and disempowering the upper classes, but had more respect for democracy than the commies did. What set them apart was their willingness to get their hands dirty. The little fish in the world's biggest pond needed to make some noise to get noticed, and they did this through terrorism. It was in Vologda where Savinkov would be introduced to the SRs, where he would become an official party member along with an old university buddy named Boris Moiseyenko, and it was here where Savinkov would decide that terrorism was a career path for him. Now, Savinkov was a man who couldn't be tied down, and you can't be a good party member when you are being technically imprisoned. So on July 10th, 1903, he decided to escape Vologda in the most epic fashion possible, by walking out the front door. No, seriously. He just got on a train to Arkhangelsk, ditched his stuff, and hopped on a boat to Norway. He got there and dodged customs by essentially walking past them with a hard hat and a clipboard, and by the time the feds realized he was gone, he was on a ship to Antwerp and far outside their jurisdiction. Don't forget, man speaks 4 languages, he can basically get anywhere with enough smooth talking. By the time August rolled around, he was in Geneva, Switzerland, where he was welcomed by our new protagonist in the SRs with open arms. Now, when I say terrorism, I don't mean what you probably think of when you think terrorism. The SRs were nothing if not principled, so their terror tactics were entirely directed at those in power. Their strikes were surgical and explicitly tried to avoid civilian casualties. In Russia, terrorism was a political tool that was not aimed at stoking widespread fear, but rather provoking the masses into popular uprising. Still not something for the faint of heart, but Savinkov didn't give a shit. He barged into the SR headquarters and immediately jumped at the opportunity to fuck some shit up. Took a while to get a job because of bureaucracy, so he kinda just hung out with Moiseyenko and Kalyaev and did a bit of writing. Finally, in October of 1903, things kicked into motion. He was approached by a man named Yevno Azeff. Azeff was the leader of the militant wing of the SRs, the combat organization. They were the terrorist guild, and Azeff was terrorist-in-chief. He made a big impression on Savinkov. He was a brilliant organizer with a silver tongue, and was one of those guys that came off as just super trustworthy. Savinkov came to trust Azeff implicitly. Azeff soon brought him and his buddies into the organization, and immediately got everyone on a train straight back to Russia. Terrorism is a learn-on-the-job type of field. Practicum, you know. Savinkov was to take the position of planner and organizer, the role he would hold for most of his time in the combat organization. Their first target was the interior minister, Vyacheslav von Plehve. Plehve was a skilled but somewhat unremarkable bureaucrat hated by many for his development of the Okhrana, support of Russification in Finland and Armenia, and his general anti-Jewish sentiment. Their first actual attempt on his life on March 18th of 1904 went poorly. The guy who was supposed to be throwing bombs chickened out, and Plehve's carriage passed by 2 other guys when they were unprepared. Azeff disappeared for a long fucking time, and a couple of weeks later, one of the group's more experienced terrorists, Alexei Pakodolov, blew himself up in his apartment while arming the bombs for another attempt. So far, it had been a shit show, but mama didn't raise no bitch, so Savinkov continued to try anyway. After a fuck up on July 8th, they elected to attack for realsies on the 15th. That morning, one member of the team, Igor Sazonov, was in the right place at the right time. He whipped a bomb straight through the window of Plev's carriage. There was a big kaboom, and Plev was dead on the spot. Savinkov watched this happen from down the street, and the scene of an actual explosion shook him to his core, at least for a while. Everyone remembers their first time, I suppose. The remaining members of the group, Savinkov included, skipped town and returned to Switzerland. The death of Plev came at a perfect time. You see, Russia was currently getting its ass handed to it by a little country nobody cares about called the Empire of Japan. The war was aggressively unpopular, and the entire country was destabilizing around the Tsar while he clung to hopes of a victory that never manifested. This assassination had spooked a lot of people, and did a hell of a job at getting the Tsar to at least concede some political ground. For the SRs, that was a glorious victory, and Savinkov got a nice promotion to second in command of the combat organization. He spent some time in Paris, where he would receive his next target, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich Romanov, at that time the Governor-General of Moscow. Yeah, the SR leadership got cocky as fuck after they offed Plev. They figured that if a couple more bodies hit the pavement, then a revolution in Russia was imminent. They were partially correct. Sergei was kind of an asshole, much to the same degree as Plev. Reactionary, anti-Semitic, authoritarian, you know, the works. But unlike Plev, Sergei was also kinda shit at his job, so even parts of the royal family didn't like him. Revoking his life privileges became the goal of Savinkov's team, and this time he would plan it all himself as Azeff had fucked off again. I wonder what he gets up to when he's mysteriously absent. Savinkov brought Kalyaev, Moiseyenko, and a very radical woman named Dora Brilliant, whose only goal in life was to die for the revolutionary cause. They hopped on a train back to Moscow and in November started their work. However, they were very suddenly on a very tight schedule. People had been getting more and more rowdy through the fall of 1904, leading to widespread strikes and anti-war demonstrations. After an incident at a factory, a bunch of people, led by one Georgy Gapon, wrote up a petition. It called for things like improved working conditions, universal male suffrage, an end to the war, and other things. Thousands staged a peaceful march on the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to deliver the petition to the Tsar on January 22nd, 1905. He had left the day before, and all the people around were a little tense. The military was called into the city, and when the marchers encountered them, they started shooting. This bloody Sunday did nothing to help the tensions in Russia, who would have fucking thunk it, and it led to a massive strike wave which kick-started the, spoiler alert, First Russian Revolution. The SRs didn't want to be left out of the fun, so they rang Savinkov and said, "Hey, what's the holdup? Would you kindly put the bastard in the dirt soon? Please and thank you." So he found an opportunity to jump on the guy in early February. Sergei was found to be attending a concert on February 15th. Kalyaev would be the one to do the deed. However, when the time came, he didn't go through with it. As it turned out, Sergei had been planning to attend this concert with his wife and adopted children who were in the carriage with him when Kalyaev went to attack. He wasn't about to hold the kids accountable for the sins of the father. He brought this information to Savinkov, who was almost mad for compromising the mission, but he really wasn't because come on, who actually wants to blow up kids? So they called it a night and tried again 2 days later. Sergei was a bit cocky and his security was kinda shit, so when he was leaving the Kremlin with no guards around, Kalyaev rushed his carriage and essentially dropped the bomb in the guy's lap. Kalyaev survived somehow, which made him much luckier than Sergei, who had largely ceased to exist as a coherent entity. Kalyaev was immediately hauled off to jail. He dies, obviously. But interestingly, 3 days after the assassination, the wife of the late Grand Duke, Elizabeth, paid him a visit in prison. They had a short and rather conciliatory conversation, whereafter she gave him a small icon. In April, he was sentenced to death, with his execution carried out on May 5th. Elizabeth became a nun, founding the Martha and Mary Covenant of Mercy, where she dedicated her life to doing good works and helping anyone who required it. We'll find out what happens to her a little later. Anyways, Savinkov had a brief mental break because of the whole ordering the death of another human being thing before returning to Switzerland. While he was away, the team that stayed in Russia got unexpectedly arrested, and his parents' home in Warsaw was raided again. I wonder how the Okhrana caught on to their activities. It was a traitor. One of their guys in Siberia, Nikolai Tatarov, had cracked and become an informant for a lighter sentence. Anyways, things kept getting worse. His brother Alexander, who was also serving a stint in Siberia, shot himself in March, and his father Victor had a mental breakdown and succumbed to stress and old age in November. It was a bad time all around, but Savinkov could not return to his family, at least not yet. He spent most of 1905 rebuilding the organization. However, shenanigans were at play, and they were betrayed again by the same guy, which forced Savinkov to flee once again. Interestingly, an anonymous letter would be received by the SR leadership that pointed fingers at 2 SR Combat Org members, claiming they were Okhrana rats. The first was Todorov, and the second was Azeff. But of course, Azeff couldn't be a rat. He literally helped plan the murder of several high-ranking Tsarist officials. How could he be a rat? Anyways, this little tidbit got put on hold because Russia just peaced out with Japan and a huge strike had broken out. This led to the October Manifesto of 1905. A Bill of Rights for the people and a State Duma with universal male suffrage. Actually fucking huge. All of the jailed terrorists were released too, which was nice. Of course, this didn't really have the intended effect. It almost caused a civil war right then and there, with monarchists and black hundredists clashing in the streets with liberals and leftists over these new reforms. In response to this, the leftist groups formed the St. Petersburg Soviet, a sort of pseudo-parliamentary body within which the Bolshevik faction immediately voted for a revolution. Moscow revolted in December, after which the Tsar called in the army, which crushed the revolution violently. Oh, Russia never change. Bad news for Savinkov, though, he was out of a job. The SRs temporarily put a halt on terrorist activity as a show of good faith, because any progress is good progress at this point. Savinkov told them to shove it, though, and tried organizing a bunch of attacks on infrastructure, but those would go nowhere because the cops were on his ass and seemingly knew his every move. Eventually, the party elected to boycott all Duma elections because they weren't winning, and started doing terrorism again because fuck the Tsar, all my homies hate the Tsar. Things kinda went badly. Azeff kept making perplexing decisions, a bunch of people were arrested, and they failed multiple assassinations over the spring and summer of 1906. Savinkov was able to get Todorov killed in March, and in April they bumped off Gapon, who, plot twist, was actually a police agent, but other than that, they were mostly unsuccessful. The real problem occurred in May, when Azeff sent Savinkov to Sevastopol, where he was almost immediately arrested under very strange circumstances. Both his mother and wife came down to help break him out of prison, which he succeeded in doing with the help of some sympathetic soldiers in July. He returned to Europe and laid low for a while. Meanwhile, Russia is still a shit show. As it turns out, building a democracy out of an autocracy is not easy, so the Duma was a clusterfuck. It lasted all of 3 months before being dissolved by Tsar Nicky. There was an attempt by Savinkov to see if the new prime minister, Peter Stolypin, had any cracks in his security through September, but no dice. Upon this chronic lack of success and things to do, the SRs fired Savinkov as leader of the combat org, so now he was truly out of a job. He moved to Paris, where he was rejoined by Vera before the pair moved to the Mediterranean coast. They got a visit from Azeff in January 1907, afterwards traveling around Europe a bit. Near the end of 1907, more personal tomfuckery occurred. His marriage began to struggle, this time because of another woman named Evgenia Zilberberg. Savinkov tormented himself trying to decide whether or not he actually loved Vera, and came to the conclusion that he didn't after several months. Vera left sometime in February, returning to St. Petersburg permanently and taking the kids with her. They were on decent terms and they wrote to each other on occasion, and Savinkov tried to support his kids financially whenever he could, but their relationship was over. He never formally married Evgenia, but the two would be together for most of the rest of his life. He spent the rest of his days in France, mostly writing and occasionally offering support for a terrorist plot or two, but they never really went anywhere. He languished until May of 1908, when the Party of Socialist Revolutionaries was struck by a crisis that they were shockingly unprepared for. It begins with a journalist named Vladimir Burtsev. He was a historian by education and really liked snooping in places he realistically had no reason to be in. He started a journal in 1905 after the October Manifesto and was a close friend of Savinkov. Back in May of 1906, an Okhrana whistleblower who was sympathetic to the leftist cause came into his office and gave him the rundown. The Okhrana knew fucking everything about the SRs, and they knew it because there was a rat in a very, very high place in the party. He couldn't come up with a name because the Okhrana was pretty good at keeping identities a secret. So to avoid jumping the gun, Burtsev started doing a big think. Eventually, a big list of coincidences made itself apparent, and the one name that kept popping up in all of these situations was Azeff. A whole web of tomfuckery could be tangentially related to the guy. The police always knowing where Savinkov was, breaching safe locations that no one should know about, the occasional wave of arrests that seemingly came out of nowhere, it all made too much sense. So much sense, in fact, that Burtsev got his offices raided and needed to flee to Europe for a while. If you hadn't picked up on it by now, Burtsev was absolutely right. Azeff had, in fact, been a double agent for the Okhrana. Had been since he joined the organization. He used his talents to play both the SRs and the Okhrana, extracting as much from both organizations as he possibly could. He got paid fat fucking stacks by his police handlers, while also reaping the benefits that the SRs brought. He escaped suspicion by being actually good at his job and getting people killed, and pretending that he had no knowledge of the plots that actually succeeded. To compensate, he basically fed the Okhrana numerous SR members, including Savinkov. It was honestly a pretty brilliant scam, and it would have probably worked for much longer if Burtsev didn't have balls of tungsten. Later on, a former chief of police straight up told him that Azeff was, in fact, the man he was looking for, which gave him the confidence to bring this to the SR leadership. He was immediately met with jeers. Everyone trusted Azeff. Like, motherfucker planned an assassination on the Tsar himself. How could he be a rat? Savinkov wanted Burtsev murdered for having the audacity to accuse the man of such activities, but cooler heads prevailed and he was placed on trial in October of 1908. Even after he brought up his direct confirmation of this fact, everyone was still on the fence. Eventually, though, Savinkov was able to put his previous bias aside and thought about it, and slowly started to believe that Azeff was the rat. He went and interrogated him, and with newfound skepticism, his stories weren't quite adding up. After further confirmation from more sources, the party leadership were convinced. On January 5th, Savinkov and a couple others went to Azeff's place and basically told him the jig was up. Problem was, they suffered a sudden rush of shit to the brain because they left and didn't bother posting a guard. So, Azeff dipped, jumped on a train to Berlin less than 2 hours later, and was gone. Savinkov failed to ever find the guy, and the great rat himself lived the rest of his life in comfort, dying in 1918. The Azeff affair had consequences. The party was permanently shaken. The Central Committee resigned for its failure, and the combat organization was disbanded. The event also made international headlines, proving to everyone that Russia was having a rough time over there. The Duma flew into a frenzy, accusing the government of supporting terrorism against its own people. It took a speech from Stolypin to calm the country down, but the damage had been done. Any goodwill the regime had built up through its moderate reforms was immediately gone. This played on Savinkov's mind quite heavily, cursing himself for years afterwards for allowing Azeff to get the bag over his head. Still reeling from the end of his life in the combat org, the gradual ending of his relationship with Vera, and the deaths of close family, Savinkov became a very jaded fellow. And if that wasn't enough, now he had to live, exiled in fucking France. Savinkov would remain in France until 1917, which is in the ballpark of a decade. I don't know, I'm shit at math. He mostly occupied his time by writing. His most notable work was a book called The Pale Horse, which was a fictionalized and dramatized account of his own life as a terrorist. The main character was kind of a self-insert, but not really. I mean, if you read it and imagine Savinkov in his shoes, it definitely tracks, but there's enough differences to make it slightly less obvious. It was published in January of 1909 and was met with mixed reviews. Most Russian literary figures at the time quite enjoyed it, but many thought it was a little too on the nose for their liking, and it didn't exactly paint the SR leadership as particularly competent. It was successful enough to make a name outside of being one of Russia's most wanted terrorists, and gave him a modest income to live off of. Emboldened by his success, he published another novel in 1912 called What Never Happened, which was, similar to Pale Horse, a fictionalized account of events that he had experienced. This time, the 1905 revolution and the exposure of Azeff. The left hated this book too, much for the same reasons, but hey, some folks on the right actually thought it was kind of charming. While we're here with some downtime between set pieces, I'm gonna make a quick note about his personality and ideology. The Azeff affair really dampened his mood. Prior to 1908, he had a sort of starry-eyed view of life. Very much a guy of noble death and the cause and that sort of thing. Afterwards, like I said, he got jaded. He became big into fatalism and a somewhat twisted version of nihilism. Basically, instead of life is meaningless and we're all going to die, he went, life may be meaningless, but death gives it purpose. His life as a terrorist became an almost utopian ideal. To kill and die for your country, people, and ideals is the highest honor a person can have. This came with a never say die attitude, extreme single-minded motivation to accomplish what he set out to do, and a complete acceptance of death that would greatly influence his life going forward. He still maintained a charismatic exterior, but after 1908 he was simply a darker individual. Not the kind of guy you'd want to have a beer with. Events that occur in the future only worsen this. By the time of his death, he was a broken man who had not only been responsible for the deaths of thousands, but had been betrayed and let down so many times by men he came to see as weak that he simply had faith in nothing. And yet, he still maintained an almost irrational and absurd third hope to the very end, which will be made apparent later. As his personality shifted, so too did his views about the world. As we established, he began life as a hardline socialist, but as events transpired, he shifted more towards the center, and later the right. Very late in his life, he would also come across a particularly funny system that attracted him greatly, but that's for later. The main unifying thread is a very visceral hatred of Bolshevism that has begun developing. He could see the future and knew damn well that they were just going to be a red Tsardom, and nothing will have been gained. Most actions he takes from here on out can very much be looked at through an anti-communist lens, which will make many of his self-contradictions make more sense. Ultimately, he was one of those guys who kinda transcended traditional political lines, and by the 1920s his ideology was a patchwork of populism, federalism, and social nationalism. He also developed a particularly sour view of democracy due to witnessing its failure firsthand. That said, he did directly declare himself to be a Republican Federalist even after this, and his dalliance with dictatorship was seemingly a decision made out of anti-Bolshevik pragmatism, more so than an actual ideological shift. Overall, he is a very complex figure, and I think trying to categorize him as one specific ideology would do him a great deal of injustice. Other than that, he kinda just existed in limbo. His first son with Yevno was born in 1912, named Lev. He wrote, he gambled a lot, he just, lived. He also received regular visits from Okhrana agents who stalked him for basically his entire time in the country, just making sure that he wasn't going to do anything funny. For the next 2 years, the man was basically aimless. He was probably depressed for most of it. In the end, while terror was the thing that put him into this state, it would also be the thing that got him out of it. Yeah, it's Great War time. It's the Great War. He doesn't live long enough to call it World War I. As it turns out, when given the choice, Savinkov chose to go to an active war zone, running the risk of being blown into a billion tiny pieces by an artillery shell, rather than live the rest of his life surrounded by French people. Based. More specifically, he decided to use his writing skill rather than his getting people murdered skill, signing up to be a war correspondent for a newspaper in St. Petersburg and report news from the front in France. He went up and down the entire Western Front, getting a pretty well-rounded experience and cataloging his time in a book called In France During the War. He greatly admired the camaraderie and democratic ideal of your average soldier and did his work as a journalist with as much honesty as he could slip past the careful censorship of the powers that be. Savinkov was a supporter of the war. He wanted a socialist democratic Russia with no Tsar, but he preferred the Tsar to a fucking germ any day of the week. His views were not necessarily shared by many on the revolutionary left. The outbreak of the war immediately split the RSDRP further to the point of no return. Mensheviks took the standard socialist line, war is cringe, we don't want war. However, the Bolsheviks figured that World War I would be a great way to kickstart violent revolutions. They didn't support the war, but they did see it as an opportunity. Meanwhile, the war caused a split in the SRs too. At the beginning, much of the party followed Savinkov's thoughts. Most actually supported Russia's war effort in the name of national solidarity and extracting concessions from the Tsar. There was a minority faction that was anti-war, however, and Viktor Chernov, the leader of the party, even attended the Zimmerwald Conference, which was a big meeting of anti-war socialists. In essence, the closer to the center you were, the more likely you were to support the war. Of course, as you may know, Russia had a not very good time. They suffered horrendous casualties, the economy tanked, people started rioting and protesting, it was hell. Russia would almost come back in 1916 with the Brusilov offensive, nearly destroying Austria's army as a concept, but guess what? No. This poor performance made agitators of even the pro-war guys, and very quickly the country descended into chaos. Change was coming to Russia, whether it liked it or not. On February 23rd of 1917, what was essentially an open rebellion broke out in Petrograd. Many troops who were expected to quell the uprising ended up joining it, and soon the rebellion turned to revolution. The Duma declared a provisional government, the leftist factions re-established the Petrograd Soviet, and on March 2nd, Tsar Nicholas abdicated. 370 years of Russian Tsardom came to an end almost overnight. The immediate mood across the country was something between overwhelming euphoric elation and a complete breakdown in order unprecedented in the history of mankind. The working and underprivileged classes immediately took control of their own fates, at least for a moment. The Okhrana was gone, the authoritarian police were gone, the censorship so many were used to was gone. A beautiful feeling of freedom rocked the entire country, and for a moment, many simply felt optimism they hadn't experienced in a long time. Of course, though, politics is a dangerous game, and building a new democracy from essentially nothing is a very complicated endeavor. The next few months would set the course for the rest of Russian history. Now was the time of chaos. Savinkov was ecstatic. The thing he had fought for his whole life had finally come to fruition. The new regime came with full pardons, and Savinkov quickly got a new passport and made plans to return to Russia. He arrived early in April, dropping off his stuff at a friend's place, and immediately hightailed it to the Tauride Palace, the building where the new Soviet had been established. Viktor Chernov had been elected its vice chairman, and Savinkov was welcomed warmly. However, cracks had already begun to show, and the very first thing the Soviet did was give itself the right to tell the government to go fuck itself on military affairs. This, Order Number 1, had effectively abolished the military chain of command, which would have consequences later. This was enacted largely because the SRs had turned against the continuing of the war, something Savinkov would be completely unable to reconcile with. Another funny thing that occurred during this time was the return of the Bolsheviks, as Vladimir Lenin had arrived on the scene and was looking to fuck some people up. Savinkov was, at the end of the day, a Democrat. If the people wanted the Bolsheviks around, then he probably would have begrudgingly supported them. However, their authoritarian nature and willingness to act directly against the interests of the people more often than not meant he came to fucking despise them. After his visit to the Soviet, he hit up the Minister of War to see what he could do to help the Russian military hold off the Germans. At this point, the army was dying slowly and painfully, but it was still a force that could do things. As the provisional government was more willing to keep the war going, he put his hopes in them and was made Commissar of the 7th Army, which was down in Ukraine. Despite having zero military experience and the position of Commissar being rather ill-defined, he served as best he could. He was initially disliked by the conservative elements of the military and the officer corps, but he proved himself a very good speaker and a distinguished gentleman if nothing else. So by the end of his term, he became quite popular. He even managed to shut down a fermenting soldier rebellion using only his charisma and dashing good looks, so he clearly was pretty damn good at his job. What made him controversial, however, was his military traditionalism. He figured the revolutionary talk of soldiers' councils and abolition of hierarchy was fucking dumb, especially if you want to actually win a war. This belief put him on a collision course with one General Vladimir Kornilov. Kornilov is a funny guy for a different video, but what you need to know is that he was a solid commander, very traditional in regards to military matters, and a kind of Republican. Savinkov believed that he was the man who could restore the army's backbone and prevent Russia from getting reamed by the Germans even harder. Kornilov wanted to go fight some people and wasn't doing a whole lot, so when Savinkov asked the government to make him leader of the 8th Army, they said sure. Back in Petrograd, a man named Alexander Kerensky, who was an SR himself, had just become Minister of War, which may have influenced this appointment somewhat. Kerensky and Savinkov turned out to be quite similar, and this would lead to Savinkov being promoted to Commissar of the entire Southwestern Front in early June, just in time for what would come to be known as the Kerensky Offensive. Kornilov's part of the army did well, but everywhere else ranged from slow progress to complete catastrophe. Huge parts of the army mutinied after a few weeks, the Germans undid all of their progress, and the Russian military finally ceased to exist as a relevant combat organization. Savinkov was in the building with Kerensky when the offensive began, and the fact that the parts of the army that he was commissar of did the best caused his popularity with the government to shoot up, even though he wasn't actually commanding it. He used this relative success to petition for his new ally Kornilov to be promoted to commander of the entire Southwestern Front. Interestingly though, Kornilov turned out to be much less Republican than Savinkov thought, and despite believing that he was the man who could save Russia, he kind of went, how about no, please, that would be bad, when the topic of overthrowing the government and establishing military rule came up. Through the next while, Savinkov's democratic and socialist ideals will be slowly eroded by reality within the country. However, he seemingly did not believe that dictatorship was the path forward. He repeatedly got into spats with folks like Kornilov and Denikin over the autonomy of the army, and always insisted that the rule of law be maintained and that the military should work with the civilian government. The coming weeks would really test those beliefs. In regards to the whole offensive, Nat 1 is still a critical failure, and because of this string of fuck-ups, the Bolsheviks attempted a coup during an event known as the July Days. This failed primarily due to people getting cold feet at the last moment, resulting in a bunch of arrests and Lenin fleeing to Finland. This shook the government further, however, and after another crisis, our good friend Kerensky managed to worm his way into the captain's chair, becoming Russia's new prime minister. This meant that the Minister of War position was vacant. I think you can see where this is going. In 4 months, Boris Savinkov had gone from a disgraced former terrorist to occupying one of the highest government offices in the entire country. Reactions to his appointment were characteristically all over the place. The moderate left and right were pretty stoked, and the military was pretty happy, but the extreme left and the monarchists hated the guy for reasons we've already established. He had barely sat his ass in his chair before he began enacting a little plan of his. First things first, put the Bolsheviks in the ground. They had stymied the provisional government's functions and attempted to overthrow it twice. They had to go. So, with Kornilov's help, he prepared a proposal that was so absurd, if Kerensky accepted it, and got it passed, would drive the Bolsheviks out of government in frustration. This proposal included 4 things: introduction of the death penalty for matters of national security, military control of railroads and military industry, and the countermanding of that Order Number 1 I mentioned earlier. If this passed through, then he would have succeeded in committing the government to the war, getting rid of some Bolshevik power, and showing that the government could accomplish these things through proper legal procedure. He did his best to convince Kerensky of the necessity of this, but by mid-August he had flat-out rejected any discussion on the death penalty, and even threatened to dismiss Kornilov. This begins one of the strangest episodes in the entire revolution, known in hindsight as the Kornilov affair. You see, Kerensky was not having a good time. He was getting paranoid, and he had successfully gaslit himself into believing that Kornilov was going to stage a coup. He figured that the reactionaries were more dangerous than the left, so he tried to poke Kornilov with a stick to get him on treason charges and put him away. On August 20th, he sent Savinkov down to tell Kornilov to send troops to the capital to place the city under martial law. He returned to Petrograd to a note from Kerensky that basically said that Kornilov was actually planning to overthrow the government and install himself as dictator. Savinkov went, "Wait, what the fuck, that's not right," and tried to convince Kerensky that this was probably a misunderstanding, but he went lol, lamau even, and shipped Kornilov his dismissal. Savinkov rang him up, got his side of the story, and tried again to get Kerensky to lay off. He did not succeed, Kornilov refused to step down, and shenanigans ensued. The stick poking worked wonders. Now that he had mutinied for real, what the fuck do you do if he just refuses to be arrested? Savinkov was a man loyal to the law above all else, so he reluctantly disavowed Kornilov and was promptly made military governor of Petrograd. This was basically back to square one for him, but he didn't want to jeopardize his position and risk losing out on affecting change permanently. Of course, though, Kerensky continued to screw up. Since there were no units to defend the city, he went to the Bolsheviks for help, pardoning those that were in prison and giving them guns. Great. This proved unnecessary because, as it turns out, the huge force approaching Petrograd did not exist. It was a small force that came close, and they exchanged a few shots with the defenders before going, "Wait, what are we doing here anyway?" and dispersed on August 29th. Kornilov hadn't even left his command post. Kerensky had accomplished his goal, though. Kornilov was ruined and quickly arrested. However, in order to get rid of a cockroach, he had given a shotgun to a home invader. This would have catastrophic consequences. On August 31st, Kerensky hit up Savinkov and said, "Hey, thanks for helping out defending the city. Also, you're fired. No severance. Bye." This was done to pacify the increasingly Bolshevik-dominated Petrograd Soviet, which didn't like Savinkov for being friends with Kornilov. His coalition was actively falling apart, and he kept swinging further left to try and hold on to power. Meanwhile, a major player in the Soviet, our old buddies in the SRs, expelled Savinkov from the party in absentia, ending 15 years of membership with nothing more than a tip of the hat. He promptly left the capital and fucked off south to pal around with the Cossacks. As a last-ditch attempt to stop the inevitable, he attempted to convince the Don Cossack regiments to go to the capital and support the government against the Bolsheviks. However, Kerensky refused to give some moderate concessions, and possibly the last chance for survival of the Republic had slipped away. You all know what happens next. On the night of October 24th, 1917, Bolshevik-aligned forces seized control over important locations in Petrograd and laid siege to the Winter Palace. Kerensky ran away and tried to find help, but the only people he found were soldiers who hated his guts, and the troops that offered help were barely okay with his existence anyway. The night of the 25th, the cruiser Aurora shelled the Winter Palace, which was followed a few hours later by a small skirmish and a surrender of the defenders of the building. The provisional government now toppled, Lenin stood on his metaphorical soapbox and proclaimed, "State power has passed into the hands of the organ of the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, the Revolutionary Military Committee which heads the Petrograd proletariat and the garrison. The cause for which the people have fought, namely the immediate offer of a democratic peace, the abolition of landed proprietorship, workers' control over production, and the establishment of Soviet power, this cause has been secured. Long live the revolution of workers, soldiers, and peasants." This understandably alarmed Savinkov, and not just because the new Bolshevik government immediately put out a hit on the guy. Shortly after, he learned that Peter Krasnov and his Cossacks had actually heeded Kerensky's call and were currently in Tsarskoye Selo, very close to Petrograd, and made an effort to join them. Unfortunately, Kerensky couldn't conjure up reinforcements for the Ataman, so his small attacks were checked by the Bolshevik forces. When Savinkov and Kerensky finally reunited, the man was in the process of a nervous breakdown. So, Savinkov elected to see if he could go grab other troops. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, the Bolsheviks came down on Tsarskoye Selo hard the day after he left, dispersing the Cossacks and forcing Kerensky to run. He basically ceases to have relevance after this point, fleeing the sinking ship to the United States. As for the SRs, they were also, for the most part, having a time. After the July days, the party had formally split. Marie Spiridonova split off with a small group to form the Left SRs, a decidedly anti-war splinter faction that also advocated for a takeover of government so that they could actually get shit done. After October, this group aligned itself with the Bolsheviks and was later destroyed by them because fuck you. The Right SRs, meanwhile, condemned the revolution for what it was, a coup that went against the wishes of the population. However, for a while at least, they waited for the Bolsheviks to hold their planned election and pretended that they didn't exist. When that election did come, the SRs won handily, pissing off the Bolsheviks, causing a scuffle, and eventually driving the Right SRs away from Petrograd and scattering them. After this, the once mightiest party in Russia simply slowly dissolved. Anyways, Savinkov did not succeed in finding troops, instead returning to Petrograd on November 6th. He didn't stay long, making contact with Vladimir Nabokov, yes, that one, I personally love continuity between videos, who told Savinkov that he needed to get south right now, because that's where the resistance would be. As he traveled, he saw Russia descend into complete chaos firsthand, reinforcing his willingness to do whatever it took to stop the Bolsheviks here. He arrived in Novocherkassk by December and met with the leaders of the volunteer army. These included Alexei Kaledin, Mikhail Alexeyev, and Kornilov, who, spoiler alert, all die in less than a year. Savinkov was not offered an actual effective role, largely due to many of the rightist elements not trusting the man they saw as a socialist terrorist who betrayed the army multiple times. Undeterred, he decided to do his own thing, heading back to Petrograd in January of 1918 to try and convince some people to come down to the Don to help out. He arrived just in time for the Bolsheviks to hold an election, lose, and then go, hey no, that was a warm-up, it doesn't count, and immediately destroy the assembly that they had just set up. All political parties were promptly banned, and their leaders were either imprisoned or fled. Savinkov showed up, went, I guess there's not much left to do here, eh, and promptly tried to return south. Once again, however, he accidentally escaped death for, like, the 10th time this video, as while he was out, Novocherkassk was taken by the Reds in an uprising, and the Whites were almost crushed right then and there. So he went to Moscow instead and hunkered down for a little bit. Now, two slight tangents. 1. The Bolsheviks changed the calendar on January 31st of 1918, eliminating the funky dates that came with the Julian calendar, and jumping everyone ahead to February 14th. I stuck with the old-style dates before this, just because I refused to call it the November Revolution. That's fucking stupid. Going forward, dates are in line with the rest of the world. Second, more background activities. At the end of 1917, the Bolsheviks established the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage under the Council of People's Commissars of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. As funny as it would be for me to rattle that off every time I mention this group going forward, I think I would rather kill myself than do that, so we're gonna call them their colloquial name. The Cheka. The Okhrana had spent years oppressing the population, terrorizing dissidents, and engaging in acts of subterfuge, torture, and murder. So the very first thing the Bolsheviks did was establish an organization that was designed to oppress the population, terrorize dissidents, and engage in acts of subterfuge, torture, and murder. Pots and kettles, what can I say? It was functionally a rebranding of the Okhrana, and Savinkov would come to be very familiar with them. Anyways, while in Moscow, a big thing happened. The Bolsheviks dropped out of World War I in March of 1918 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This prompted a direct Entente intervention in Russia, which gave Savinkov a bit of hope. Together with one Colonel Alexander Perkharov, a constitutional monarchist who was working with the underground resistance in Moscow, they formed the Union for the Defense of the Motherland and Freedom. It was a big tent organization that brought together anyone of any belief who wanted to fight the Reds. It was not going to be a terrorist group like the Combat Organization, instead being a literal insurgent army numbering over 5,500 members by the end of May. Their general goal was to assassinate a few bigwigs, then launch several uprisings in support of the Whites in the South. Things were off to a rough start when the organization was almost beheaded at the end of May because a dumbass couldn't keep it in his pants and blabbed to a nurse he was simping for, who promptly ratted them out to the Cheka. However, Savinkov was a smart man, so the Union survived due to its decentralization. After recovering from this, they settled on a plan. The French were going to come in from Arkhangelsk and march south to help depose the Bolsheviks and bring Russia back into the war. The Union would need to take Rybinsk and Yaroslavl, planned by Savinkov and Perkharov respectively, and hold them until their reinforcements arrived. Perkharov went first on July 6th and actually succeeded in taking the city. However, the Reds counterattacked fiercely. They held for 17 days before capitulating. The city was functionally destroyed, and the Bolsheviks would execute hundreds as punishment. Meanwhile, Rybinsk went very badly. Savinkov delayed the uprising by several hours waiting for more men, which gave time for an unknown traitor to tip off the Cheka that shit was about to go down. They arrested several men in a nearby village, which in turn gave them all of the plans for the uprising, allowing them to crush it with ease. The French hung them out to dry, as one would expect from Frenchies. Both Savinkov and Prokhorov would succeed in escaping their cities, regrouping in Kazan. While all of this was happening, the left SRs were staging a revolt of their own. They had come to the conclusion that they had signed a Faustian bargain with the Bolsheviks after Brest-Litovsk, so they assassinated the German ambassador in Moscow and seized the city. Another opportunity to end the Bolsheviks had arrived, and was immediately blown by the indecision and hesitation of the left SR leadership. Their coup attempt failed, obviously. The Bolsheviks only stayed in power through sheer fucking luck, if you couldn't tell. The Reds were also busy committing atrocities. Remember Elizabeth, wife of the late Grand Duke Sergei? She visited Kalyaev and became a nun. Well, in early 1918, she was arrested along with 8 others and taken to a town called Alapayevsk, northeast of Yekaterinburg. The night of July 17th, several Cheka men took the prisoners to an abandoned mineshaft. Here they were beaten savagely before being blindfolded and thrown into the pit by the guards. Elizabeth was sent first. She was most likely dead before she was dumped, along with a couple others, but some of her companions weren't. The executioners wanted to be sure they were dead, so grenades were tossed in the hole, and when those failed to produce results, dry brush was lit on fire and stuffed into the mouth of the mineshaft, asphyxiating anyone still alive. This came a mere 1 day after the execution of the entire royal family. This was all done ostensibly to deny the whites a rallying figurehead, capstoning a very, very long July in Russian history. By the time Savinkov arrived in Kazan in August, the Czechoslovak Legion had occupied the city. These victories by anti-Red forces emboldened the former SR members of the assembly, and a new government was established in the city of Samara, which then moved to Kazan, coinciding with a Siberian republic popping up in Omsk. These governments suffered from the same indecision and debate that previous democratic movements had. Savinkov was initially sidelined, much like he was in Novocherkassk, many seeing him as a right-wing asshole who tried to help Kornilov overthrow the republic. Truly the plight of the enlightened centrist. So instead of the government, he signed up for the cavalry. His first ever experience as a regular soldier went pretty well. They did a little sabotage, killed some Bolsheviks, and got into one battle in which they utterly butchered a big formation of Reds by being a little sneaky. When he returned to Kazan in early September, he was immediately forced to leave the city because while he was out, Trotsky had shown up and was in the process of shit-canning the defenders. They fled to Ufa, then to Omsk, where they continued to do anything but to actually act. This time, however, the government decided to make Savinkov go away. He was made the leader of a diplomatic mission to Paris to try and drum up support for the cause, but in practice this was an exile from Russia once again. He got on a boat in early November and began a long journey to the west, going on what was essentially the world's longest cruise. He arrived in Marseille on December 25th to the news that the Omsk government had been overthrown by Alexander Kolchak. This little event left Savinkov in a state of diplomatic limbo for a while, giving him some time to reunite with his second family and schmooze in Paris for a while. Things got even more complicated when Anton Denikin, the new leader of the volunteer army, sent his own diplomat to France, which, if you've been counting, makes 3 separate Russias. Eventually, Kolchak stopped dilly-dallying and simply snubbed Savinkov entirely, giving all the other Russians in Paris the actual jobs. So he took it upon himself to become the mouthpiece, doing a press tour where he did his best to bitch about the Bolsheviks as often as possible. He attempted to use this to get Russia an actual seat at the Paris Peace Conference, but no dice, so he just continued being as loud as possible. On August 19th, Kolchak finally took his fingers out of his ears and confirmed that Savinkov did indeed exist, appointing him as an actual member of the Russian delegation to the Entente. However, due to Kolchak being a dumbass and Western leaders being less than cooperative, he didn't get much done, with one notable exception being his cooperation with Winston Churchill. This guy hated communism and wanted a strong British Empire, so he was willing to pull some strings and help Savinkov out. He even got a whole-ass essay written about him in Churchill's collection Great Contemporaries, which really shows how infamous Savinkov was. The two formed an alliance of sorts, and they elected to try and force Denikin to democratize a little to elicit more foreign support. He also received a boost from an unexpected source. An envoy from Poland had arrived, saying that if the whites agreed to some concessions, that the Poles would help them fight the Reds. Unfortunately, Denikin ghosted Savinkov at this critical moment, and this alliance didn't manifest. Fucking race to the bottom here, I swear. Through 1919, the whites gained ground which was promptly lost, collapsing with remarkable speed after Denikin's advance on Moscow had failed. Going into 1920, the whites were essentially beaten. Kolchak dies in February, with Siberia going with him, and the army in southern Russia would be driven into the sea over the course of the next year. Despite these setbacks, Savinkov still saw some potential in Poland. In January of 1920, he was invited out to a meeting with Josef Piłsudski. The main thing of note is that he offered Savinkov the chance to form Russian units to fight for Poland. They would sign an agreement that June after the Polish-Soviet War had broken out that allowed him to do just that. He definitely tried his best. However, Poland struggled to supply troops that Savinkov tried to arrange. There was a lack of bodies that could be effectively brought to bear. The Whites, now under General Wrangel, and Poland refused to cooperate. Things just kind of went poorly. Only a single small unit of this army in Poland actually fought in the pivotal moments of the war, and by the time any effective force could be built up, the war was over. He wasn't about to stop, though, because now he was just fed the fuck up with all of this political chicanery that he had been engaged in for 3 years. So his little army launched an offensive into Belarus, mostly with the aim of blowing things up and causing issues. His belief shifted back towards his pre-revolution socialist days, but this time with a slightly different spin. He said, fuck the commies, fuck the monarchists, we need a new peasant-oriented direction. He referred to this new movement as a green one rather than red or white, occupying a third position, if you will. Anyways, in November 1920, he invaded Belarus just in time for Wrangel's army to finally break, functionally ending the white movement. Making matters worse was that a lot of the guys who were fighting for Savinkov were virulently anti-Semitic, which resulted in a lack of local support for their little invasion and international condemnation. Savinkov, for his part, hated this and did his best to stop any pogroms that he could, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. They returned to Poland in December, where the army was disarmed and disbanded. He would spend 10 more months in Poland playing Endsieg, making grand plans to overthrow the Bolsheviks through sparking peasant uprisings and assassinating key figures, but reality clashed with his optimism. Uprisings had broken out, most notably at Tambov and Kronstadt, but Savinkov was unable to really help them out. The Cheka also arrested one of his guys and made him turn, causing most of his network in Russia to be destroyed. The rebellions were eventually put down, and the Bolsheviks had finally consolidated their hold over the country. To top things off, Evgenia had essentially broken up with him over letters because, like with his first marriage, he wasn't around very often. I can respect a man who doesn't give up even when he's lost, but unfortunately, the Bolsheviks could not. To get rid of him once and for all, the Reds made Poland an offer. 10 million rubles in solid gold on your desk tonight if you throw Savinkov out of the country. Honestly, damn good deal. On October 30th of 1921, Savinkov and his biggest allies were exiled from the country into Czechoslovakia. The Russian Revolution and its subsequent civil war were over. He was immediately told by the Czechs to go away, so he went back to France. When he got there, he was summoned to London by Churchill to take part in a small plot to force concessions from the new Soviet regime by withholding the desperately needed economic aid. The two had gotten the Prime Minister on board initially, but he walked back on this later, so nothing really came of it. His life also continued its seemingly endless spiral downwards. He received a letter in March of 1922 from his brother that said his sister Nadezhda had been shot by the Cheka in Taganrog. At this point, Savinkov was an unhappy man who probably just wanted to retire to a cottage in the Alps and sleep for 3 weeks. However, he was a man of unstoppable conviction, and he looked everywhere he could for things to do that may hurt the communists. And, of course, his gaze fell on Italy. Savinkov would go on to become quite acquainted with one Benito Mussolini. He would come to take a great interest in fascism as an ideology, and a few days before his death, he would write a letter in which he claimed that fascism was close to what he believed. Now wait, stop. Take your hands off that motherfucking keyboard. In situations such as this, we must acknowledge nuance. At this point in the history of everything, fascism was a largely unknown and untested ideology. The corporatism, extreme authoritarianism, centralization, anti-Semitism, and racialism didn't quite exist in their final forms yet. Savinkov would have admired it for its populism, nationalism, and fervent anti-communism. He also believed that the movement was fundamentally democratic due to fascism propagandizing itself as the party of workers and peasants, which were the groups that he had fought his whole life for. And, in his own words, because it stands for action and total effort in comparison to the lack of will and the starry-eyed idealism of parliamentary democracy. Does this clash with his previous views? Absolutely. But when this shift is taken in the context of the failure of the whites and the tyranny of the Bolsheviks, it makes a lot more sense. Like many people, he bought into the propagandized version of fascism and didn't really live long enough to have that illusion broken. It may also be helpful to know that he didn't want Italian fascism in Russia specifically. Much like communism, he figured fascism would be too extreme a leap for Russia to take since their society simply was not ready for something like it. Russia lacked the industrialization, centralization, and homogeneity for it to be feasible. If Savinkov ever rose to power, he likely wouldn't have instituted an actual fascist dictatorship. His governance likely would have taken the form of a very strange hybrid ideology that combined all of the different things that influenced him through his life. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Regardless, what's important is that he was indeed acquainted with Mussolini. Small fucking world if you couldn't tell. The two had a cute little meeting in March of 1922 where Savinkov agreed to help the guy counter communist activities in Italy and neighboring nations on the condition that he wouldn't assassinate anybody. This was spurred by an economic conference being held in Genoa that would be attended by Soviet representatives. Mussolini wanted any communist demonstrations contained but didn't want anybody killed because that would be a bad look. Well, the Cheka, now called the State Political Directorate and later renamed to the Joint State Political Directorate, or OGPU, had been living up to the Okhrana's legacy and had been stalking Savinkov everywhere he went, and they had managed to eavesdrop on this meeting. Soviet media promptly whipped itself into a frenzy, bitching that Boris Savinkov, known terrorist, was definitely 100% planning to assassinate people on behalf of the fascist leadership in Italy. Of course, this is Savinkov though, so he was 100% planning to assassinate people. He got a small team together and attempted to intercept the Soviet group in Berlin. His target was Foreign Affairs Minister Georgy Chicherin, a former Menshevik who drifted to Lenin's side after the revolution. He was pretty chill, all things considered, being pragmatic in regards to foreign relations and preferring a degree of cooperation with the West. The Berlin attempt failed due to extremely tight security and the OGPU tipping off Western media about Savinkov being around, blowing his cover. So he went back to Genoa, where he utilized a body double and posed as a journalist. He then proceeded to get in good with the OGPU guys, offering them his services as an informant, and almost got into the hotel where the Soviet delegation was staying. Of course, though, identity fraud is a crime everywhere, and both he and his double would be arrested on April 18th in two different places for two different reasons. This is before modern DNA testing, so it took the Italian police and the OGPU several days to figure out what the fuck was going on. He was almost extradited to Russia to stand trial, but a little bird in a high place had his back, instead having him exiled back to France. Back in France, Savinkov was forced to lay low for a while once again, continuing to just do his thing. He wrote another book through 1922 and 23 titled The Black Horse, also a fiction piece, but this time based on more recent events involving his resistance to the Bolshevik regime. This one was not received very well by critics because I guess some people can't separate art from the artist, but it is what it is. However, this wouldn't be the most important thing to occur during this period. Beginning in late 1922, one of Savinkov's agents in Russia, Leonid Shishenya, began sending reports and letters from an underground Republican organization in Russia. The group was known as the Liberal Democrats, led by a former monarchist officer, Andrei Mukin. It was wholly committed to resisting the Bolsheviks and liberating Russia from their tyranny. Furthermore, the group was currently divided on their next course of action. Some wanted to foster popular support, while others believed in quick and decisive action against the government. Mukin believed that the legendary Savinkov could be the one to provide decisive leadership to the LDs. That December, one of his other men in Russia, Mikhail Zekunov, returned to the Union headquarters in Warsaw with further corroboration of the claims made by Shishenya. Savinkov was elated. This was a chance to finally bring the Reds down from the inside. He sent one of his guys into Russia who reported that the LD leader would come to Paris to meet with him personally. He arrived on July 14th of 1923. They met several times, with Savinkov's apprehension gradually eroding. Mukin came packed with intel and reports of various acts of sabotage carried out by the group. Furthermore, he reported that the economic situation in the country had devolved to the point that a third revolution was genuinely likely, and if Savinkov were there to provide his leadership, they could act. The man he made the biggest impression on was Savinkov's right-hand man, Sergei Pavlovsky. After Mukin left, Savinkov remained skeptical but curious about the whole thing, so he decided to send Pavlovsky into Russia. Reports quickly flowed back to Paris of the wild successes of the LDs, including one which declared that Savinkov had been elected leader of the group in absentia. This, in essence, formally merged the Union and the LDs into one pretty powerful organization that stood a genuine chance in fighting the Bolsheviks. Finally, after over 2 years of correspondence and discussions, Savinkov decided to return to Russia in May of 1924. For all of the confidence that he had, he seemingly fully expected to die. He made sure his will was in order, leaving most of his possessions to his sister Vera while naming her executor. He also made one final trip to one of the few people he unconditionally trusted, Burtsev, the man who brought down Azeff all those years ago. Upon discussion, he promptly went, "Are you fucking stupid? This is so obviously a trap." However, Savinkov had determined that the risk was acceptable, and if he was killed, so be it. He set off with two close friends and a buddy of his from the Union in Warsaw, arriving back on Soviet soil on August 15th. Mukin was waiting at the border crossing point with two other men, Sergei Pazitsky and Ivan Krikman, both members of the LDs disguised as border guards. The group headed for Minsk, where it split up to avoid too much suspicion. Savinkov's group arrived at a designated apartment in the city late on August 16th. They got settled into the dining room and idly chit-chat for a while. Eventually, Andrei Mukin raises a toast and declares that he needs to leave. A few moments later, a dozen very well-armed men rush into the apartment, led by a man in an OGPU coat named Roman Pilyar. Savinkov was under arrest. Wait, what? Yeah, Savinkov had just been had. Played like a goddamn fiddle. In hindsight, it's so impossibly obvious that none of this shit was real. But I suppose for a man with few options, you gotta jump on anything that is even potentially plausible. You wanna know how they did it? Well, let's jump back to the Italian kerfuffle. The GPU said, okay, this is getting ridiculous, we need Savinkov dead yesterday. So when they established a section dealing with foreign espionage, he was named Public Enemy Number 1. It was run by Arthur Artazov and overseen by Genrik Yagoda. The endeavor to catch the man himself was given the name Operation Syndicate. The only question was, how can you convince the notoriously careful and paranoid Savinkov to voluntarily walk into a trap? They found their answer in Leonid Shishenya, a former comrade of Savinkov who had been arrested during the summer of 1922. He had communist sympathies, as it turns out, breaking pretty quickly and agreeing to be a turncoat. Another agent, Andrei Fyodorov, would pose as the leader of a fictional organization that would act like it was doing things to resist the Reds. Mikhail Zekunov was also a turncoat, acting as a middleman, and through him in Shishenya, Artazov began telling Savinkov all of the pretty things. Because, of course, the Liberal Democrats were led by a white officer, but they were divided and needed a strong, driven leader to help them overthrow the Bolshevik regime and end its tyranny. Shockingly enough, it got him hook, line, and sinker. When Fyodorov arrived in Paris, he fed Savinkov some false intel and tried to get on his good side. Literally everything he said was made up. Even the acts of sabotage were just random accidents taken from the newspapers around the country. When Sergei Pavlovsky went to Russia, his arrival was telegraphed in advance, allowing for a very easy arrest. He initially refused to squeal, however, after they floated the death penalty, he decided to also become a double agent. Reports quickly flowed back to Paris of the successes of the LDs, all triple-checked and corroborated by three of his allies. It took a long time of careful scheming and ass-kissing, but finally Savinkov decided to return to Russia, and they got him in handcuffs with very little difficulty. It was game over. He was shuffled off to Moscow to the headquarters of the OGPU, Lubyanka. Here he would be wardened by Pazitsky and monitored very, very carefully. Over the next couple of weeks, there was a lot of talking. During this time, it would appear that Savinkov did a little soul-searching. Somewhere between his arrival in Lubyanka on the 17th and the date of his trial on the 27th, he very likely made a deal with someone in a very high place. Not only did he plead guilty on all charges that were brought upon him, but he did something unexpected. He acknowledged the Soviet regime as the legitimate government of Russia, apologized for his previous actions against the regime, and expressed belief that the peasants and workers truly supported and benefited from communist rule. His death sentence was promptly commuted to 10 years in prison by the Central Executive Committee. The crazy bastard had escaped death once again. It is not specifically known whether he legitimately changed his mind on the Bolsheviks on his own, did it with a boot on his neck, or just straight up lied as part of a scheme. But he gave the government what they wanted, a propaganda piece. His remarks immediately made headlines worldwide, and he started writing propaganda for the Soviet government. Basically, everyone he ever knew back in the West immediately disavowed him for his committing treason against the very ideals that he had built a reputation on. In return, his life in Lubyanka was pretty solid. He was basically put in a Norwegian prison cell while everyone else was in a Russian one. He was given access to basically anything he asked for short of freedom, which included trips to restaurants and theaters with his guards, alcohol, writing utensils, and living conditions that most free people in the country could only dream of. He was allowed regular visits, including from his first family that still lived in the city now called Leningrad. He was also now a grandfather, with his daughter Tatiana having a son of her own. Furthermore, his writings were allowed to be published, and he was paid for them. He made a fuckload of money while straight up in jail in a communist country. Honestly, based as hell. Of course, though, the songbird was still stuck in the cage, regardless of how pretty the golden bars looked. The Soviets had no intention of letting him out. His first request for a pardon in January of 1925 went unanswered. Every other request he sent was similarly treated. Despite his good treatment, his imprisonment still weighed heavily on his mental health. He was now 46. If he spent the full 10 years in jail, his life would be basically over by the time he left. Through the course of 1925, he gradually broke down further and further, spiraling into a depression, his conversations with his wardens becoming more and more grim. He even advocated to be shot multiple times, claiming that it would be better than just sitting around like this. As hard and adventurous as his life had been prior, at least he was free. Here, he was simply a tool. At this point, he wasn't even allowed to go out on his own terms. And by the looks of things, his freedom had been snuffed out permanently. On Thursday, May 7th, 1925 at 8 p.m., he was finally granted at least one request: a trip to the countryside for some fresh air. He was joined by 3 men: Pazitsky along with Valentin Speransky and Grigory Soroshkin, 2 other OGPU agents. He had sent a letter to Felix Dzerzhinsky, head of the organization, earlier that day inquiring about his freedom. This had made him quite nervous during the car ride out to the park they were going to. When he told Pazitsky this, the man shattered his hopes, telling Savinkov that he could be sent to Siberia for having the audacity to ask for his freedom so early. This did nothing to assuage his nervousness, but it may have helped him make up his mind on something. They continued on, spending some time at the park. It was a beautiful spring evening. The group returned to Lubyanka around 11 p.m., going to a 5th floor office. He shares this room with Pazitsky, Speransky, and Soroshkin. They have a simple task of keeping an eye on the man while they wait for the guards to take him back to his cell. They were not doing a particularly good job. Savinkov was visibly unwell. He had been pacing back and forth and was making seemingly random small talk with his captors. At this exact moment, it is impossible to know exactly what he was thinking. Maybe he was reminiscing about his past, or maybe he was planning for his future. A future that would come very, very quickly. The room was defined by a large, open window. He approached the window and breathed deeply. He had done everything to save Holy Russia. He had given everything except, well, there was nothing more he could realistically do. But he was intent on retaining mastery of his destiny. It was time for one final act of defiance. He would achieve his freedom one way or another. Speransky checked his watch. 11:20. Boris Savinkov took one final look at the men around him and decided to say goodbye in the most Russian way possible. And the rest, as they say, is history. There is a possibility that events transpired differently that night, and Savinkov was actually tossed out of the window to look like a suicide. This is based off of a single quote from Big J Stalin that was almost certainly spoken in hyperbole, so I personally doubt that this was an assisted suicide. Ironically enough, regardless of circumstances, man got off pretty light. He died on his own terms, at relative peace with himself, his past, and the world around him. His captors were not so lucky. Whether he knew it or not, our friend Big J had a wicked sense of humor. Artizov, shot. Fyodorov, shot. Pilyar, shot. Pazitsky, shot. Shishenya, shot. Soroshkin, shot. Yagoda, believe it or not, also shot. Every single motherfucker responsible for the capture and imprisonment of Savinkov was dead before 1939. Sometimes you can't help but laugh a little at the absurdity of some of this stuff. As for the verdict on the man himself, I'm gonna let y'all come to your own conclusions for this one. In my opinion, he's a man of nuance to the point that it's hard to get a complete read on the guy. At the end of the day, he doesn't get to choose how he's remembered, but you do. Was he a noble revolutionary seeking to topple an unjust and tyrannical regime? A socialist terrorist seeking to destroy the established order? Or a reactionary adjacent turncoat who nearly brought down the revolution he claimed to support? Was he a fascist sympathizer who turned his back on his own morals and beliefs in a single-minded pursuit of his goal? Or was he simply looking for alternatives in a world that had broken him? He could be all sorts of things, but perhaps he was just a man who wanted to set Russia free, whatever that means. That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.